I've come face to face with a god. He lives in the sky, and he's a giant flying whale. If you've played the game Skyward Sword, you know what I'm talking about. Leviathan, Spirit of the Skies, is a pretty awe-inspiring sight for a Wii game. When I was little, I spent hours circling around this deity, at times coming so close to divinity I felt I could reach out and touch it. So you can imagine my excitement when I learned that Breath of the Wild, a game set tens of thousands of years later, also includes Leviathan. He's dead. There are many stories in which divine beings come to an end. But what happens after a god dies? Would they decompose, their godly forms rotting away to nothing? Or would they linger, their figures forever changing the surrounding environment, or even becoming an environment themselves? Would they ever really die? The short film The Drowned Giant is about, well, a drowned giant, obviously. But that obviousness is the point. Washed up on an otherwise ordinary beach near a small town, the giant's corpse is a blunt truth, something the narrator and other locals cannot ignore or rationalize. Without any context for where the body came from, it's at first treated as a deity, the crowd reverential and apprehensive. But then, something changes. This colossus, be it god or monster, begins to rot. And just like that, the spell is broken. The townspeople swarm the fallen titan, clamoring over its immense form, as if trying to re-establish their own importance relative to the super being. Over the following days, animals descend upon the carcass as well, hastening the disfigurement of the remains. Though disturbed by the general lack of respect, the narrator cannot, in the end, resist the urge to climb upon the corpse himself. The fact that the giant's decay, its decomposition, is what strips away its godhood in the eyes of the masses speaks to the inherent paradox of a dead deity. In most classical mythologies, dying is the pastime of mortals. What makes a god is their immortality, their permanence. The narrator has the sense the giant will reawaken, that something so powerful in life must still hold power after death, but the body remains motionless. Soon, people see it as just another piece of trash, an unsightly obstruction that should be disposed of. They eventually decide to cut the body into sections and haul it away piece by piece. The drowned giant is ultimately a melancholy examination of mortality, of how any being can be disrespected and forgotten, no matter how large they loomed in life. It is one thing to gaze upon the corpse of a god you did not know. It is another thing entirely to know a god before it falls, and know a god after. In the Xenoblade games, godly beings called titans are so numerous, it's actually hard to keep track of them all. That is, except for in the third game, which makes things simpler by turning all titans into lifeless husks that now make up the landscape. The reasons for this are too much to get into, trust me, but the tragedy here is pretty straightforward. Here are the shells of beings that you know if you've played the other titles in the series. The game doesn't draw attention to these remnants either, which is notable since Xenoblade is, on balance, a pretty loud franchise. Instead, the remains quietly fade into the background. Most characters don't even remember what they were. I think what saddened me most about Leviathan's corpse in Breath of the Wild, aside from my celestial whale friend being a pile of bones, is the fact that no one seems to remember this deity. There are some researchers who debate his identity, but they assume he was just a large, extinct animal, not the god I knew him to be. But I really can't judge, because there are actually other giant whale skeletons scattered throughout this game. When I first saw these, I didn't pay much attention. As it turns out, they're actually the remains of other whale gods from throughout the series, lost deities that I didn't even know about. For beings that were once worshipped, it's hard to imagine a more tragic fate. These gods haven't just died, they've been forgotten. One isn't likely to forget the deities of the God of War saga. In the current series based on Norse mythology, clashes between gods and other divine beings regularly reshape the landscape. The sheer scale of godly power that these games capture is just astounding, creating countless unforgettable moments. It's curious, then, that the experience that stuck in my mind the most wasn't meeting a living god, but a dead one. Midway through the first game in the Norse saga, you arrive upon the mountainous corpse of Thamur. Though technically a giant rather than a god, in-game lore suggests Thamur had the power to challenge Thor himself, a power so great it continues to shape the world in death. Even decaying, Thamur's body emits a maelstrom of cold that has frozen the surrounding ecosystem, an effect you can see from miles away. His sheer mass also flattened an entire village when he first fell. This idea is also present in the Greek God of War titles, where the death of a Pantheon member had an immediate and apocalyptic effect on whatever domain they had authority over. Unlike the other fallen gods discussed so far, Thamur still holds influence over the environment in his icy, cadaverous grip. You don't just observe the power of Thamur's corpse from a distance, though. You have to climb it, and the act of scrabbling up the side of this colossus, like I was one of the townsfolk from the Drowned Giant, conveyed to me the scale of a god's power better than any of the series' most gonzo action beats. When I recently replayed Breath of the Wild, I tried clambering up the Leviathan skeletons, an experience that reminded me just how small I was in comparison, and that even in death, these gods, too, still hold power. At a glance, it doesn't seem like there's a dead god in the game Jusant. What there is, dominating every frame, filling every inch of your thoughts, is the mountain. And your job, your singular goal, is to reach the summit. As in God of War, the very act of climbing in Jusant feels like a form of worship. Every handhold is a prayer, every completed route a hymn to the mountain's power. Jusant also requires you to make these leaps of, well, faith for lack of a better word, where you're suspended on nothing but a rope and the trust that the mountain will hold you. It is in these moments that you can get the closest to fathoming the true size of the mountain's body, to comprehending the extent of its power. You encounter the remains of multiple civilizations as you make your way to the peak, cultures that rose and fell entirely within its shadow. It is clear in the art that these societies have left behind that this mountain was something they worshipped. To the people who lived upon its body, the mountain is a kind of god. And this god has died. There is a sense that the present-day peak is a husk, a dried-out skeleton of its former self. The wreckage of boats, fishing equipment, and withered coral that scar the landscape indicate a vast ocean once surrounded this region. The game's very title, Jusant, a French maritime term for a period of low tide, supports this narrative. Without getting into spoilers, there's evidence this drought came from human activity throwing the ecosystem out of balance. This mountain was a god, and we have killed it. There is a polluted, corpse-strewn deity on the face of the earth. Its name is Mount Everest. Actually, its name is Chowmalungma in native Tibetan, meaning Goddess Mother of the World. The name Everest comes from Welsh cartographer George Everest, a man who famously disliked the idea of a deified peak being named after an outsider. But the name stuck with the English-speaking world, and so too did an obsession with scaling this icy god. Today, hundreds of people climb the summit every year, many of whom are wealthy, inexperienced outsiders following well-traveled routes. Yet Chowmalungma, or Everest, still holds frigid, unpredictable power. In his book Into Thin Air, author John Krakauer writes a first-hand account of the 1996 Everest disaster, a blizzard in which 8 climbers lost their lives. This event was a tragedy, but also not uncommon. Since the 1920s, over 300 people have died trying to reach the peak, a staggering 1/3 of whom have been guides from the Sherpa community, an ethnic group indigenous to the Himalayan subregion. Outsiders have long relied on Sherpa guides to make it to the top of the mountain. Edmund Hillary, often called the first person to summit Everest, did so alongside Sherpa mountaineer Tenzing Norgay. Guides face significant exploitation and inconsistent safety measures, often carrying much of a client's gear. Between oxygen tanks, tents, and food containers, literal tons of garbage have been left on the slopes. In their haste to ascend a god, tourists have left her body disfigured and the community disrupted. In the epilogue of Into Thin Air, Krakauer relays an account of a Sherpa orphan lamenting the state of the sacred mountain, stating, "Outsiders find their way into the sanctuary and violate every limb of her body by standing on top of her, crowing in victory and dirtying and polluting her. For many, climbing Everest is clearly not an act of worship." There's something wrong with the holy mountain in Horizon Zero Dawn. I could tell there was something wrong from the start of the game, when I looked up and saw these eldritch metal tentacles spilling out of the mountain like mechanical intestines. A post-apocalyptic title, Horizon is full of the wreckage of civilization, the skeletons of buildings and cars and lampposts, and for the most part, these ruins feel benign. The only thing menacing about them is what they imply, that some terrible fate befell humanity. But the ruins on the Holy Mountain don't feel benign. They feel like a disease. It isn't the exterior of the mountain that the survivors in Horizon worship, however. It's the interior, a chamber containing a god called All-Mother. To the viewer, it quickly becomes clear that this god is a fragment of ancient technology, one the survivors revere for saving them from an apocalyptic danger. The tentacled corpse smote upon the mountainside also has a name, although it isn't called a god. It's called the Metal Devil. And once you hear that name, the story of what happened to the world starts to fall into place. In fiction, the corpse of a devil has a very different presence than the corpse of a god. In the Studio Ghibli film Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind, civilization was wiped out by biomechanical weapons of mass destruction called god warriors, although most survivors now see these creatures as demons. But in both Nausicaä and Horizon, there are characters who seek power in these accursed remains, attempting to wield the rotting, long-fallen devils against their enemies. We're getting into spoiler territory here, but in each narrative, attempts to wield these demonic weapons end in further apocalyptic disaster, the characters inevitably losing control, undone by the same human arrogance that had previously destroyed the world. It's no accident that both these stories contrast these remains with nature, framing them as the consequence of disrespecting the natural order. Ultimately, these demonic corpses feel like humanity's punishment for trying to play God. Human hubris can become its own fallen god. There's a decomposing colossus punishing the characters in the 2014 Russian movie Leviathan, and it's not the giant mysterious whale skeleton you see throughout the runtime, or at least, not entirely. The true deity putrefying in the background of Leviathan is, instead, a societal one. All of civilization that we see throughout the film feels like it's rotting from the inside out, infested with governmental corruption. The film's title appears to reference the Hobbesian Leviathan, or at least an idealized version of it, the deity of society one buys into for a nation to function. In the film, this deity is rapidly decaying. Wooden ships like rib cages collapse upon the shore. A fish processing plant calls to mind a slowing circulatory system, all the workers inside the final blood cells dragging this organism along before the inevitable. A condemned house is picked apart like a beached whale, first by stragglers and then by the apex predator of a demolition machine. Though not technically set in the post-apocalypse, this world seems to have died a long time ago, and is only now beginning to stink. I think part of why the dead Leviathans in Breath of the Wild struck such a chord with me has less to do with the state of the remains and more to do with the state of the world around them. Though it doesn't always look like it, Breath of the Wild is a true post-apocalyptic narrative set after a calamity destroyed much of civilization. This devastation is embodied in the appearance of another deity in the series. In Skyward Sword, the goddess Hylia is represented by a shining statue, fitting for an era of relative prosperity. In Breath of the Wild, the statue of Hylia is overgrown, forgotten in a half-demolished cathedral abandoned years ago. It's a testament to how much of the world has been lost post-calamity. I think that's what I was really mourning. Not just Leviathan, but the larger, abstract Leviathan of a functioning society. Not a Hobbesian one, but a kind of community that wouldn't have forgotten the dead so easily. But must a fallen god represent an end? Or could it also represent a new beginning? Though less common, there are stories where a god's death brings new life, their remains serving as a foundation upon which something new is built. The Marvel Comics city of Nowhere is built in the skull of a fallen celestial, basically that universe's equivalent of a god. In the animated series The Owl House, an entire civilization thrives on the bones of a still rotting deity. I've said the word rot a bunch in this video, but in nature, rotting isn't something inherently negative. The decomposing remains of a leviathan like a whale can feed other life forms for years, even decades. Such events are called whale falls, and while I talk more about them in my video on Dead Worlds, it's worth reiterating just how much life these sea gods bring to the ocean floor, their skeletons becoming miniature ecosystems. Has such a life form even died? But there is another kind of godly skeleton that produces another kind of rot. The eeriest region in the game Subnautica is the Lost River, a noxious environment flooded with toxic brine. And at the center of this fallout are the bones of the gargantuan Leviathan, a creature so much larger than the other in-game life forms it borders on the divine. There's a sense that the Leviathan's decomposition is what's creating this poisonous brine, that its power still haunts the environment even after death. But even here, there are creatures that have adapted to this briny wasteland. In fact, some species seem to flourish down here, their entire life cycle tied to these pestilent remains. Life upon such a polluted, adversarial Leviathan is a struggle. It's unpleasant, but it's still a life. On Earth, polluted holy sites are rarely abandoned by the people who worship them. There are no statistics on how many bodies of water or mountains have been contaminated over the years, but a quick search shows you the numbers are in the hundreds, if not the thousands. Many of these sites are still regularly visited by individuals who must risk their own health to continue their way of life. And most of these sacred landmarks are far from beyond saving. Even Everest, despite the severity of its trash accumulation, could be made into a healthy region once more. But it would require effort, a change in the way these places are unprotected. It would require struggle. Hyper Light Drifter is a game about fighting for your life, no matter the conditions or the fallen titans before you. At least, I think that's what it's about. See, Hyper Light Drifter doesn't contain a single line of dialogue, communicating its themes entirely through visual and environmental storytelling. And the visuals that leave the biggest impact are easily the remains of the Titans. These immense beings lie scattered throughout the world, and their presence is, well, it's disheartening to say the least. Because there is a rot, a sickness, slowly overtaking the character you play as, seemingly related to whatever wiped out the Titans. Though there's evidence the Titans weren't the nicest creatures, if these beings, these gods, have all perished, what chance do you have? The theme of Hyper Light Drifter is rooted in personal experience. Lead designer Alex Preston was born with a deteriorating heart disease, which he cites as an inspiration for the game's presentation. You can also see this in the title of the game's studio, Heart Machine, and in the giant, literal Titan's heart you can find that, despite being robbed of a body, continues to beat. Like the drowned giant, one of the titans has been disrespectfully cut into pieces, and yet its fractured parts continue to function. Alex Preston, who is still making games by the way, knew Hyperlight Drifter might be his last ever project, and yet he pushed through and created something that will last into the future. At the end of The Drowned Giant, the narrator is surprised to find some of the being's bones have become part of the town, its scattered remains becoming structures and supports for houses. Though the giant is gone, its influence is not. It reminds me of a story in Norse mythology. Though only briefly mentioned in God of War, in the original Norse myth, there's another giant-turned-divine corpse called Ymir. Following his death, Ymir's body becomes the foundation for the entire world. Out of Ymir's flesh was fashioned the earth, and the mountains were made of his bones, the sky from the cold frost giant's skull, and the ocean out of his blood. Something can still be made from the body of a fallen Leviathan, even if it isn't the same as it once was. Maybe it's wrong of me to wish Leviathan had stayed the same. I don't know what life he might have nurtured, what ecosystems fed upon his remains. Leviathan still exists, both in my memories and on my Wii if I turn it back on, because he's from a video game, but, you know, metaphor. The Leviathan of civilization also still endures. Though much of Breath of the Wild's world has been destroyed, there are pockets of survivors from which a community could re-emerge. Maybe that society would revere Leviathan, not for the god of the skies he once was, but for the modest shelter his remains now offer. Zelda games have always had a sense of decaying divinity, that the land itself was once something sacred and is now decomposing. Even the brightest titles can capture this feeling, but there's also a consistent sense that not all is lost, that the world can still be rebuilt on the bones of what came before. The giant is still alive for me, the narrator states at the end of The Drowned Giant. I often dream of his resurrection, a colossus, striding through the streets of town, picking up the fragments of himself on his return journey to the sea. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this entry, please lend your support by liking, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon to stay up to date on all things curious. See you in the next video.